play and call it work.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to the next episode of Lore Hunter, where I hunt for the answers to your lore questions. This is the first time I've actually announced that title. You may have already seen it in intros or thumbnails. I'm not quite sure if you've seen it in previous episodes because I filmed the first 6 episodes all at the same time. That was a suggestion by Nick Swinson, so thank you, Nick, for that suggestion. In my first episode, I asked for ideas for the name of the show, and a lot of ideas were given. MiniWarGaming was a cool one. I saw things like Lore Master or, Master of the Lore kind of stuff, and I don't like that connotation because as much as I consider myself to know a lot of the lore, there is way more that I don't know than I do know. And the concept of this show is more that you ask a question, and either I know the answer, but if I don't know the answer and I'm interested in it, I will hunt for the answer. So I prefer the idea of being a lore hunter than a lore master. It'll be many, many years of lore hunting before I can consider myself a master of the lore. And so you can ask whatever kind of questions you want, because even if I don't know the answer, I can look for the answer, do the research for you, because I love that kind of stuff. And I'm always doing that kind of research anyways for my narrative campaigns, so it makes sense. So thank you, Nick, for the name. So I am your lore hunter, and that's why it's singular, because it's just me. And I will be answering your lore questions. So today's question comes from Lord Zephyrus. Is Warhammer Fantasy exist in 40K as an isolated planet? So this is an interesting question because if you had asked this question 5-10 years ago, I would have probably had a different answer. And the answer would have been maybe. And now I can say no, really no. And the reason for that is because they've really started to differentiate the lore of Warhammer Fantasy, or in this case, Age of Sigmar, from 40K. Let's first talk about why some people think that Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40K were in the same universe. Now, there's some very, very obvious parallels to draw. First, and probably the most obvious, is Chaos. When you collected a Chaos Demons army for Fantasy, the only difference between that army and the same Chaos Demons army for 40K was the bases. They were square in Fantasy to fit on the movement trays, and circular in Warhammer 40K because they didn't have movement trays. But you could really switch between them. If you just put them on square bases, you could easily use them in both of them because it wasn't too important to have circular bases back then on your models. Now base sizes have become a little more important in both Age of Sigmar and 40K. I don't think you could really get away with that, but you probably could if you really wanted to, if your friends or store mates didn't really care. So Chaos is the first obvious one. We have the same 4 Chaos gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. And they both operate very similarly. They have the same agendas, they look the same, their demons look identical, and they are basically the same thing. The motivations in Warhammer Fantasy for Chaos was the same as the motivations for Chaos in Warhammer 40K as well. And so really you can see that kind of same idea. I'm not super familiar with what the realm of Chaos is like in Fantasy, but I know in 40K it's basically just a parallel dimension that is affected by everybody's emotions. I don't know if that was as much in Warhammer Fantasy. I know that the magic, the winds of magic, the 8 winds of magic actually came from the realm of Chaos, which is interesting because Age of Sigmar doesn't quite talk about that as much. So I don't know if that's a retcon or if it's more a development of the idea behind that lore. So Chaos is our first big clue as to what's going on here. The second big clue is the Slann. The Slann have very big similarities to the Old Ones from Warhammer 40K. The Old Ones in Warhammer 40K are one of the original races that existed in the galaxy and actually created a lot of the races that we know today. The Eldar, presumably the Orcs, possibly the Tyranids, some people have that theory, and a lot of the other psychically attuned races to fight the Catan that they were battling at that time. The Slann, I think traditionally were always believed to be the Old Ones. Either way, we have the Old Ones in Fantasy as well. They actually use the word Old Ones in the old Fantasy lore. And then a lot of people associate that with the Slann. There may have been times where it actually was a Slann. There's been a lot of retconning. If you're not familiar, retconning means redoing the lore, like reconditioning of the lore, whatever you want. I can't remember. I don't actually know what it's short for, so we can put that in the comments below. But essentially it means like the lore used to be this, now it's this, and that old lore is no longer canon. We've seen it happen to a lot of things. And sometimes it's explained as, well, nothing really ever changed. It's just that, you know, the old Necron Codex was written by the bureaucrats of the Imperium, and they just didn't know, and so they got it wrong, and so now we're telling you the correct story. So they have all sorts of excuses for it. But essentially it comes down to this. Games Workshop has been making this game for 30 plus years, much longer than 30 years. Fantasy and then 40K around 30 years as well. So when you write for that long, and you have hundreds of writers writing codexes and novels, not everything is going to line up. In fact, we even know, like Star Wars for Disney, they decided to only make certain things official canon, everything not. Not that they don't like any of that, but it's just easier for them to be like, okay, so we'll base everything off of this. Well, a similar thing kind of happens with fantasy. Every once in a while they have to be like, well, that no longer exists, so we'll destroy it, or it just never did exist, or we'll rename it. We've seen a lot of important characters getting renamed because they were too similar to other things. So you have to realize that, first off, this isn't a real place. And so obviously, being fiction, it can be changed. And so maybe one day, before fantasy and 40K were meant to be together, and they just decided as time went on to split them. I don't know if it was always a seed of an idea, or if they actually had it be together, and then they split it, or if it's just more that it was a, hey, we have this line of demons, it'll be really cool. We don't have to make the same line twice. We'll bring over the same characters, the same demons, and all of a sudden we have two ways to sell the same miniatures, which I think is brilliant. It's awesome. They should do that as much as they can. They should do it with other things as well, like Beastmen and other, just anything that could be more generic. They started to do it with more of the other chaos stuff as well, as we can see. And so, yeah, so fantasy, you could have seen it as a world that existed in the warp. That was some theories, that in 40K there's a world that's been isolated by warp storms, or it actually is in the warp, and that is our Warhammer Fantasy world altogether. Some people went as far as to think that like the Empire was led by the same Emperor. I don't think that would ever have been the case. That's just too much of a stretch. So going back to the Slan and the old ones, some of the other reasons we have to think about the Slan and the old ones is that when the old world was dying at the end of Warhammer Fantasy during the end times, the Slan essentially took off in spaceships. It's essentially what they did. They escaped the planet on these big, huge ships, and then they floated through the void until they were reawoken and brought to the realm of heaven. And so that kind of makes us think, you know, if there's spaceships, then maybe it's technology. And we have all sorts of that kind of overlapping of technology. Is Age of Sigmar steampunk, or is it fantasy? Well, it has elements of all these different things depending on which realm that you happen to be in, which is kind of why I like it, because it allows, kind of like the 40K universe, you almost have an excuse to do anything sci-fi in there. The Age of Sigmar universe has become nice and broad in the sense that it allows you to do all sorts of different kinds of fantasy type things in there and get away with it, from the crazy to the very normal as well. So at this point though, now that the old world is destroyed and it's recoalesced into these mortal realms, floating through the etheric void, you might think, well, isn't that just the warp? Isn't it the immaterium that they're floating through? And the answer is, I really, 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 really don't think so. The properties are just too different. The etheric void, while it is kind of a chaotic place of unaligned magic, is not really affected by the emotions of the souls that occupy it. And what I mean by that is, if you got rid of all psychically attuned races in the galaxy in Warhammer 40K, you would destroy chaos. Because there's a difference between chaos and the immaterium, or chaos and the warp. The immaterium is another layer of space that follows different laws. They call it chaotic space because it doesn't follow the same laws that we do, but it definitely still follows a pattern of laws. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to have creatures that exist in there. Because if it's purely chaos, then things would just tear itself apart as soon as they were formed. But if you are psychically attuned, basically you are something that lives in both realms, like humans, Eldar, even orcs, Tyranids. They all have proven that while they're physical in the materium, in the material world, their thoughts and their actions affect the immaterium, whereas other ones like Necrons, or Catan, they don't have that same kind of thing. So you can actually see that those different races exist in both realms at the same time, kind of like their minds and their emotions exist in one realm and their physical form exists in the other, which is why they have such effect on it, and why psychers, who are really linked to between the two of them, can become conduits for the demons to come from one side to the other. And so you don't see that with the etheric void. A human who has bloodlust can draw in corn from the realm of chaos. But the realm of chaos is not the area, it's not the etheric void. It's its own area. It's not a sphere as far as we know. It's hard to explain. They don't really go into any details so far of exactly the shape of the realm of chaos. But as far as we know, it is a location in the etheric void that is connected to the mortal realms, much like the mortal realms are connected to each other through the etheric void. But the realm of chaos, I can say with utmost certainty, is not the etheric void. Those are two separate things. Whereas in 40K, the immaterium and chaos are, like, chaos is part of the immaterium. Now you might be able to argue, say, well, no, Matthew, the realm of chaos is a part of the immaterium, because once you go to areas outside of the galaxy, the immaterium could still exist. And I can see what you mean there, and you could be correct in making that assumption and drawing those parallels as well. But it still exists pretty much like if you could picture the galaxy here. Like if you, okay, here's the galaxy if we're looking down on it. And I believe that the immaterium exists everywhere. It doesn't ever say that anywhere, but it just makes sense. But the reason that we have chaos here specifically is because the galaxy is here, and that's where all the people are that are causing it to happen. So the realm of chaos is here. But the galaxy is still, if you flip it like this, right above it, or if you can picture it that way, would be the realm of chaos. Wherever there are people, there's that realm. Whereas we don't have that same kind of physical connection in Age of Sigmar. Because if they were really just worlds floating through the immaterium, then chaos would be all around them, feeding off of the souls and off of the energies of their emotions and all that. And that just doesn't seem to happen. Also, chaos now in Age of Sigmar is very different than chaos in 40K. Their individuals just act differently. They're gods. We've actually seen some of their gods now. In Plague Garden, we get to see Nurgle. In the fact that they've captured Slaanesh. And there is a physical form of these different gods that can exist. And as we can see with Slaanesh, they can exist outside of the realm of chaos. Whereas in 40K, they could theoretically exist out of the side of the realm of chaos for a short period of time. They probably wouldn't last very long. But we don't really talk too much about their physical forms. It talks more about how each demon is part of the greater god of chaos. Whereas in Age of Sigmar, they're part of the greater god, but they still are their own thing. And you might think, well, I'm just splitting hairs here because that's really the same thing. But I honestly, from all the lore I've read so far, it feels different. It feels like a Nurgling, a Plague Bearer in 40K is literally just a tiny particle of the thumb of Nurgle. Just kind of like the Tyranids are all one giant organism. I feel like all the demons are all technically the one god. So Nurgle is not just in one place, he's in all these places. Whereas in Age of Sigmar, Nurgle is in one place and he controls his minions. That's the difference here. It's the difference between my finger being me and me controlling my finger, which would be not part of me. It'd be more like I send commands to it, but it still has a will of its own, mostly bound to me. But if it was powerful enough, it could then do its own thing as well. And so we just kind of see that big difference in how chaos operates. I actually find chaos way more interesting in Age of Sigmar than I do in 40K. And so that's where I'm starting to see these differences there. And so if they're starting to make these differentiations between chaos in these two different areas, then they must not actually be the same one. They're just the same name. And just by name only, just as a relic of what Warhammer Fantasy used to be based off of. So I'm pretty sure, Lord Zephyros, that Warhammer Fantasy, or Age of Sigmar now, does not exist in the 40K universe, or vice versa at all. Now, of course, things can be retconned in the future. Who knows what they'll plan to do? But I honestly doubt that they would ever do that, because the answer to the question would be, well, why would they do it? What motivation would they have? Does it seem cool? I don't think so. It sounds like a cool idea, and you can always explore it in your own fan-made fiction, but as a whole, it would be really hard for them to combine those two universes in an interesting way that doesn't just disrupt the power in one of them or the other. So that's what I think. What do you guys think? Does Age of Sigmar Or did Warhammer Fantasy, the old world, exist in the 40k universe, maybe the Immaterium, or as an isolated planet? Leave your comments below. If you have other questions to ask that you want me to hunt for the answers, make sure you leave those in the comments as well. Thanks so much for watching. Happy wargaming.